It displaced 500 tons of oak and iron. It carried 60 cannons on 3 gun decks and enough gunpowder to level a city block. It could sail from Seville to Havana and backloaded with more gold than most kingdoms would see in a decade. And somewhere out there on the trade winds, running before a following sea with its flag snapping and its hull riding low from the weight of treasure, it was the most dangerous target in the world. Every pirate alive dreamed of capturing one. Almost none of them ever did. This is the story of the Galleon, the floating fortress that defined an era, broke empires, and made the most dangerous men alive look small by comparison. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. To understand why the Galleon mattered, you have to understand what the world looked like before it existed. In the early 15th century, European maritime powers were making the transition from coastal traders to ocean-going empires. The ships they had were adequate for the Mediterranean, adequate for the North Sea, adequate for the slow, careful coastal routes that had sustained European trade for 1,000 years. They were not adequate for what the age of exploration demanded. The Portuguese were the first to push south along the African coast. The Spanish were the first to push west across the Atlantic. Both of them needed ships that could do things no ship had ever been asked to do. They needed vessels that could survive months at sea without resupply. They needed vessels that could carry enough cargo to make the investment in the voyage worthwhile. And they needed vessels that could defend themselves in waters where there was no navy, no harbor, and no help. The caravel, which Columbus used on his 1492 voyage, was a brilliant design for exploration. It was fast, maneuverable, and could sail closer to the wind than almost any contemporary vessel. But it was small. A caravel could carry perhaps 50 tons of cargo. When the Spanish started bringing silver out of the Americas in the 1530s, they needed something bigger, much bigger. The galleon evolved from the carrack, a large, high-sided merchant vessel that had been the backbone of European ocean trade in the early 16th century. The carrack was capacious but sluggish and dangerously top-heavy. The Spanish shipwrights who developed the galleon kept the size but lowered the forecastle, the raised structure at the bow, dramatically. They lengthened the hull relative to the beam. They added gun decks that ran the length of the ship. And they created something that had never existed before, a vessel that was simultaneously a warship and a cargo carrier, capable of defending its own contents across thousands of miles of open ocean. The word galleon itself is first recorded in Spanish sources in the early 16th century. Galleon in Spanish, derived from the galley, the oared warship that had dominated Mediterranean warfare for centuries. But the galleon had nothing of the galley's limitation to calm coastal waters. It was a deep ocean creature, built for the Atlantic trades, designed to run before the trade winds from Spain to the Caribbean, and home again in a seasonal cycle that would dominate global commerce for nearly 2 centuries. The anatomy of a Spanish galleon of the mid-16th century requires some unpacking because the ship was a more complex machine than most people realize. The hull was built from oak, preferably the dense, slow-growing oak of the forests of northern Spain, and increasingly from the timber forests of the Americas when Spanish sources proved inadequate. The keel, the spine of the ship, ran from stem to stern and was typically a single piece of timber or several pieces scarfed together so tightly that they functioned as one. The ribs, the transverse frames that gave the hull its shape, were bent timber, heated and formed to the required curve, each one individually shaped to fit its position in the hull. Over this skeleton went the planking, each plank caulked with oakum, which was fiber beaten from old rope and driven into the seams with a caulking iron, then sealed with tar. A well-caulked galleon was essentially waterproof, though the caulking worked constantly loose in the working of the ship and had to be renewed continuously. Below the waterline, the hull was typically sheathed in lead, later replaced by copper, to slow the fouling of barnacles and the boring of shipworm, the Teredo navalis, which was the terror of wooden ships in tropical waters and could reduce an unsheeted hull to a honeycomb of tunnels within a year. The masts were enormous. A galleon of 400 tons might carry a mainmast 60 feet tall and nearly 3 feet in diameter, supported by a complex web of standing rigging made from tarred hemp rope, collectively representing miles of cordage. The running rigging added another mile or more. Managing this web of rope was a full-time occupation. A galleon in full sail was not a passive object. It was a continuous mechanical performance requiring constant attention and constant adjustment. The sail plan was complex. The mainmast and foremast carried square sails that ran efficiently before the wind. The mizzenmast carried a lateen sail that allowed more latitude in sailing direction. A large galleon might carry 15 sails in total, from the enormous mainsail to the small triangular staysails rigged between masts. Selecting the right combination for the wind conditions was a matter of judgment and experience, and a mistake could carry away a mast or broach the ship in a following sea. The gun deck of a galleon was one of the most formidable weapon systems of the pre-industrial world. A large Spanish galleon of the late 16th century might carry 60 to 70 guns on 3 decks. The lower gun deck, closest to the waterline, carried the heaviest pieces, the culverins and demi-culverins that could throw a 12-pound iron ball a range of 500 yards with accuracy and considerably further with less precision. The middle gun deck carried medium artillery, Perriers, and Falcons. The upper gun deck and the forecastle and stern castles carried the lighter swivel guns and anti-personnel weapons. The guns themselves were masterpieces of 16th century metallurgy. A bronze culverin was cast in a single pour, the molten metal flowing into a sand mold around a clay core that would be broken out after cooling. The bore was then reamed to precise dimensions and the exterior decorated with foundry marks, crests, and inscriptions that made each gun an individually identified piece. The gun weighed between 2,000 and 4,000 pounds. It was mounted on a 4-wheeled wooden carriage that allowed it to be run out through the gun port, fired, and run back in for reloading. Reloading was the critical constraint. Even a well-drilled Spanish gun crew of the 16th century required 2 to 3 minutes to reload a heavy gun. In a close engagement, this meant that a galleon could deliver perhaps 1 or 2 broadsides in the time it took to maneuver into and out of cannon range. The English system of continuous fire, where guns were run out, fired, and run back in an individual rather than synchronized sequence, was designed to maintain a continuous rain of shot rather than a concentrated broadside. The Spanish preference for the single concentrated broadside reflected a tactical doctrine that assumed a single devastating salvo would cripple an enemy before he could respond. Both approaches had their logic. Neither was decisively superior. The effect of a single 12-pound iron ball striking a wooden ship was catastrophic. It shattered planking into a storm of wooden splinters as lethal as the ball itself. Splinters the size of a man's arm, driven at impact velocity, could decapitate, amputate, and disembowel. The gun deck of a struck ship was an abattoir. The Spanish solution was to keep gun decks long and crews dispersed so that a single shot would kill fewer men. It was not a solution that eliminated casualties. It managed them. The treasure fleets that the galleon system was designed to protect were one of the most extraordinary logistical operations in human history. Twice a year, a convoy assembled in Seville, later in Cadiz, and sailed for the Americas. The outward voyage was divided into 2 fleets. The flota, or fleet, sailed to Veracruz in Mexico, the port of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. The galeones, confusingly the same word as the ship type, sailed to Nombre de Dios, later to Portobelo, in Panama, the port of the Viceroyalty of Peru. Both convoys wintered in their respective ports, trading Spanish-manufactured goods for American silver and other commodities. In the spring, they reassembled at Havana, where the 2 fleets merged into the combined fleet, the flota, and made the return voyage to Spain together, escorted by the Armada de la Guardia, the guard squadron of purpose-built warships. The scale of silver flowing through this system was staggering. Estimates of the total silver extracted from the Americas and transported to Spain during the 16th and 17th centuries run into the billions of pesos. The Potosi silver mine in what is now Bolivia, discovered in 1545, was producing silver at a rate that would ultimately supply perhaps a third of the world's monetary silver supply for the next 2 centuries. The treasure that crossed the Atlantic in the holds of the galleons was not abstract wealth. It was the physical money supply of the global economy, and its arrival in Spain and its subsequent circulation through Spain's debts to Italian and German bankers, into the cloth markets of the Netherlands, the spice markets of Lisbon, and eventually the economies of every trading nation in Europe, was the engine that drove the economic expansion of the 16th and 17th centuries. The ship that carried this treasure was therefore not simply a merchant vessel or a warship. It was a critical component of a global financial system. When a galleon was lost at sea, whether to storm or piracy or naval action, it was not simply a ship that had sunk. It was a failure of the global monetary system that could ripple through banking houses in Genoa and Amsterdam, disrupt the payment of Spanish armies in the Netherlands, and delay the financing of diplomatic missions in half a dozen European courts. The Spanish crown understood this with painful clarity, which is why the treasure fleet system was organized with such elaborate attention to convoy, escort, and timing. The pirates who dreamed of capturing a galleon were dreaming of more than simple theft. They were dreaming of the economic equivalent of robbing the central bank. A single well-loaded galleon could carry 500,000 pesos in silver, the equivalent of the annual revenue of a medium-sized European state. A pirate who could seize such a prize could retire in luxury. Several of them could establish a small sovereign power. No wonder the dream was universal, and no wonder the Spanish crown invested so heavily in making the dream essentially unrealizable. The defenses of the treasure fleet were layered in ways that most pirates could not penetrate. First, the convoy system itself made individual interception extremely difficult. A pirate ship, or even a pirate fleet, confronting a convoy of 20 or 30 ships, on several of which were purpose-built warships, was facing odds that no rational calculation could make attractive. The convoy's collective firepower was overwhelming. The merchant galleons themselves were not defenseless. Even the most cargo-laden of them carried enough guns to make a single pirate ship's attack suicidal. Second, the timing and routing of the treasure fleet were treated as state secrets. Departure dates were not announced publicly. Routes were varied within the constraints of the trade wind system. Known pirate haunts were given wide berths when possible. The pilots who navigated the galleons were the best paid and most carefully trained sailors in Spain, of men who knew the Caribbean with the intimacy of a lifetime's experience and who could navigate by dead reckoning across thousands of miles of open ocean to arrive at their destination within days of their estimated time. Third, the individual galleons themselves were formidable obstacles. Taking a galleon by boarding was not the romantic adventure that popular culture suggests. A galleon at anchor, her decks lined with soldiers who knew that their lives depended on repelling boarders, was one of the most dangerous environments in the world for an attacker. The Spanish soldiers who guarded the treasure galleons were not sailors pressed into service. They were professional infantry, trained to fight at close quarters, equipped with muskets, pikes, and bladed weapons, and motivated by the knowledge that pirates rarely took prisoners when the prize was as valuable as a treasure galleon. Francis Drake is the pirate, or privateer depending on whose flag you flew, whose attacks on the Spanish treasure system came closest to the dream. His circumnavigation of 1577 to 1580 included the capture of the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, known to the Spanish as the Cacafuego, near the coast of Ecuador. The Cacafuego was carrying silver from the Peruvian mines, and when Drake's men broke open her holds, they found enough silver, gold, and jewels to require 3 days to transfer to the Golden Hind. Drake arrived back in Plymouth a wealthy man, and Queen Elizabeth took her share of the proceeds, which was reportedly sufficient to pay off the entire national debt, with enough left over to invest the remainder. But Drake's success was built on an intelligence system, a degree of royal backing, and a level of personal ruthlessness that most pirates could not replicate. Drake knew where the Cacafuego would be because he had spent weeks on the Pacific coast of South America capturing smaller vessels and interrogating their crews for information about the treasure fleet's movements. He had a ship small enough and fast enough to intercept the lumbering treasure galleon before she could reach a defended port. And he had the audacity and the crew discipline to actually execute the capture once he had found her. Most pirates had none of these advantages. The typical Caribbean pirate of the 17th century operated from a sloop or a brigantine, a vessel of perhaps 100 tons that was fast and maneuverable but armed with only a handful of small guns. Against a galleon of 400 tons carrying 30 or 40 guns, such a vessel was a mosquito attacking an elephant. The galleon could simply open fire and sink the pirate ship before it came within boarding range. The only circumstances in which a pirate could take a galleon were if the galleon had been disabled by storm damage, if its crew was decimated by disease, or if the galleon's captain was incompetent to a degree that was, fortunately for the pirates, not entirely unknown. Bartholomew Sharp's Pacific raid of 1681 illustrates both the difficulty and the occasional possibility of the enterprise. Sharp's company crossed the Isthmus of Panama on foot, seized a Spanish vessel, and spent months raiding the Pacific coast, and eventually capturing the treasure ship Rosario. His success depended entirely on operating in a theater where no defense existed because no English pirate had ever been there before. The Whydah Galley is the most famous Galleon-era capture to leave physical evidence in the historical record, though technically the Whydah herself was not a galleon but a slave ship that Samuel Bellamy captured and converted into his flagship. Bellamy, known as the Black Sam for the long black hair he wore unpowdered in an era of fashionable wigs, took the Whydah in February 1717 off the coast of Cuba. In a few weeks of raiding, she accumulated a treasure that archaeologists, when they discovered the wreck off Cape Cod in 1984, found still scattered across the seafloor. The bells, the cannons, the coins, the weapons, all of it is material evidence of what a successful pirate capture actually looked like at the moment of its conclusion and at the moment of its ending. Bellamy and most of his crew drowned when the Whydah drove onto the shoals of Cape Cod in a storm 3 months after they took her. The treasure went to the bottom with them and stayed there for 2.5 centuries. The physical legacy of the treasure galleons is not confined to pirate wrecks. The galleons themselves, when they sank from storm or combat or navigational error, went down with cargoes that have fascinated treasure hunters ever since. The 1715 Spanish Plate Fleet disaster, when a hurricane off the coast of Florida sank 11 of 12 vessels in the homeward-bound treasure fleet, scattered silver coins and artifacts across miles of the Florida coast. Divers have been finding treasure from that wreck since the 18th century, and it continues to yield new finds in the 21st. The Atocha, sunk in 1622 during another hurricane off the Florida Keys, was found by Mel Fisher in 1985 after 16 years of searching and yielded over $400 million worth of silver, gold, and emeralds, making it one of the most valuable shipwreck finds in history. The Spanish galleon began to decline in the late 17th century for partly technological and partly strategic reasons. The English and Dutch navies, developing line-of-battle tactics from the Anglo-Dutch wars of the 1650s and 1660s, created purpose-built ships of the line superior to the hybrid galleon in every military characteristic. The combination of warship and merchantman that had been the galleon's great strength became a liability in an era of disciplined fleet warfare. The Spanish response was to separate those functions. Specialist warships, the Navios de Linea, replaced the galleon in the battle fleet. Merchant trade moved to vessels specialized for cargo capacity. The galleon became obsolete. The last Spanish treasure fleet sailed in the first decade of the 18th century. By mid-century, the galleon had passed into memory, but the memory was vivid enough to sustain a mythology that has never entirely faded. The galleon is present in the consciousness of anyone who has ever read a pirate story or watched a pirate film. The image of the high-sided ship with its ornate stern castle, its tiered gun decks, its great billowing sails has become one of the defining visual icons of the age of sail. It has been romanticized to the point where the reality, which was harder and grimmer and more dangerous than any romance can capture, is almost invisible behind the legend. The reality was a working world of extraordinary difficulty. The men who sailed the galleons lived in conditions that would be considered inhumane by any modern standard. They slept in hammocks strung between the guns, on deck, or in any space they could find. They ate salt beef and salt pork, ship's biscuit that was routinely full of weevils, dried peas, and whatever fresh food could be obtained in port. Fresh water was rationed and often foul. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, rotted the body from within while the sufferer was still alive and killed more sailors than storms, pirates, or enemy action combined. The men who sailed the treasure galleons across the Atlantic were not romantic adventurers. They were working men doing a dangerous and physically punishing job in conditions that offered very little comfort and very little margin for error. What the galleon represents, beyond its practical function in the Spanish imperial system, is a particular moment in human history when the technology of the ship made possible a kind of connection and a kind of power that had never existed before. The galleon could carry 1,000 men from Seville to Havana in 8 weeks. It could carry a year's revenue of a silver mine in its holds. It could transport the soldiers, the priests, the administrators, the seeds, of the animals and the tools of a civilization across 4,000 miles of open ocean and deposit them, alive and functional, on the other side. Nothing in human history to that point had been capable of such a feat. The cost was paid in the lives of the men who sailed the galleons, in the lives of the indigenous Americans whose world was destroyed by what the galleons brought, and in the lives of the enslaved Africans whose labor was mobilized to work the mines and the plantations that the galleon system served. The galleon did not exist in isolation from these costs. It was the mechanism through which they were paid. When you look at a cross-section illustration of a 17th century Spanish treasure galleon with its tiers of gun decks and its great sail plan and its decorated stern castle rising 4 stories above the waterline, you're looking at one of the most consequential machines in human history. It is beautiful in the way that all machines perfectly adapted to their purpose are beautiful. And it is terrible in the way that all machines built to concentrate and project power are terrible. The pirates who dreamed of capturing one were not wrong to dream. The galleon contained everything, silver and gold and spices and wealth beyond ordinary imagining. But it also contained something that the pirates did not think about as they planned their attacks and calculated their odds and dreamed of the prize. The galleon contained the whole apparatus of a world being made and remade at enormous human cost, and to capture it was to insert yourself into that apparatus, not to stand outside it. The ones who succeeded became rich. The ones who failed became dead. And the galleon kept sailing year after year, laden and magnificent and lethal, until the age that had created it finally ended and left it to the myths and the seafloor, where most of them eventually came to rest. And that is the galleon, the most powerful commercial weapon ever built by the age of sail, a machine that moved the world's money across its oceans for 2 centuries, that armed itself with 60 guns to protect what it carried, that defeated almost every pirate who ever came at it, and that finally sank not to enemy action, but to time, technology, and the slow obsolescence that takes everything eventually. The dream of capturing one was the dream of capturing the world itself. Most men who tried it found that the world did not surrender easily. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.